Amanda Ziadeh with WashingtonExec, and today we're hosting a panel on the current state of 5G and its role in defense and civilian agency networks. So joining me today to talk all things 5G is General Manager for Nokia Federal Solutions, Mike Loomis, and Verizon's 5G Public Sector Manager Partner, Bryan Schromsky. Thank you both for being here. So I'd like to start by asking if you could both share with our audience a little bit about your roles and what you oversee. Mike, we'll start with you.
Nokia Federal Solutions is a subsidiary of Nokia that's designed to allow us to do close business with the United States government and its agencies as a foreign entity. So it's an independent entity to mitigate that. We're focused on doing business with U.S. government across the Department of Defense and other federal agencies. There's a broad scope of communications infrastructure that we're interested in providing to the Department of Defense and these agencies, but really the focus for us, and I think as most people think of Nokia, they think of Nokia associated with wireless networking and 5G. So that's a huge focus of what we're trying to accomplish there.
Right. Thank you. And Bryan.
Thank you, Amanda, and good to see my good friend Mike there from Nokia. My name is Bryan Schromsky. I'm the managing partner. So I manage our solution architect team here at Verizon, 23-year veteran of Verizon mobility, seen a lot of things over my years as we migrate from 2G, 3G, 4G, now 5G. And exciting, who knows, we're actually running the standards now for 6G, but my team leads all the design and implementation for any 5G projects for federal agencies, both civilian and defense.
Well, thank you both so much. So, Bryan, I'm going to kick this off with you. I'm curious what some of the communication challenges are on federal campuses and military bases.
Sure, great question, Amanda. So as everybody gets excited about 5G, as Verizon and then great suppliers like Nokia develop solutions and roll them out to the federal government, both civilian and defense, there is a boom, if you will, in terms of upgrading legacy infrastructure. And what we see is a push from OSD on the defense side to actually look at science, technology, research, and engineering for 5G, which is exciting. There's a lot of money in there in play, a lot of good things happening. And I would say on the civilian as well as the rest of the defense is what's the operational aspects, right? So the day-to-day non-tactical networks, does my campus have 5G inside the building? Does it have it inside the fence line? How do we actually enable this infrastructure? We have a lot of 4G covered today on military and a lot of other civilian agencies. Right now we're on a huge build out, if you will, of 5G. Actually upgrading the towers that are on military installations as well as federal campuses, as well as responding to requests for actually agencies to actually supply and actually fund in buildings. So there's a huge growth that we see in 5G actually indoors compared to outdoors.
Mike, anything you'd like to add?
We're very thankful that we continue to see the development of applications that consume bandwidth, and that creates a need for us and our partners to improve the communications and the networking infrastructure. So we see a big push across federal campuses and military bases to get a faster time to decision making, involving technologies like AI and ML. And those require bandwidth to get data to the point of decision, make the decision, and get that information back into the hands of the user. So at the end of the day, we see those applications driving it, and then working with our partners like Verizon to provide a capability to enable those applications.
So as we talk about the current state of 5G, how can it play a role in addressing some of these challenges you both brought up? And Bryan, we'll start with you. I know you have a unique perspective from a commercial wireless point of view.
One of the big things that we see on 5G, and there's two aspects of it, right? There's the commercial and the macro build out. And as Mike mentioned, where Nokia is an integral part of this, is actually building out private 5G, which we're very excited about. And what we're seeing here is how do we actually have ubiquitous coverage and reliability? If we look at a flight line, right, to actually do things like AR, VR, next generation mechanics, if you will, right? Where the men and women actually want to use AR and VR to actually do this, right? And work on different pieces of heavy equipment. It's not inside four walls. It could be on a flight line, could be on a tactical battlefield, or things that we're doing with the Veterans Administration, right? 3D imaging. Its ability to actually take the job in hand and actually do it in the field itself, right? And some of the hindrances that we see, and we work with a lot of Wi-Fi providers, but Wi-Fi in some cases doesn't cut it, meaning that There's a lot of bandwidth requirements, as Mike mentioned, as well as the ability to have ubiquitous coverage, right? So how do we serve a very large area with the least cost? And that's where we get excited about 5G. So the ability to actually give high bandwidth and ultra low latency on a very large scale, right? So we can service a large area with less infrastructure, right? That's something that's very excited about 5G that we see today and going into the future.
Right. And Mike, how about from a private wireless perspective?
So the good news is we've been working with Bryan's team and Verizon and others for a very long time to get 5G right. It was interesting in Bryan's opening comments. He recalled, some of the earlier generation rollouts, and it's been 10 years probably since we started with 4G. And in that period of time, just as Bryan mentioned, we're looking at 6G now. We were looking at that 5G technology. In my opinion, the base tech is there from all of that due diligence that's happened already over the years. There are some other challenges. The first and foremost is vetting out the use cases. And, OUSD R&E is investing in there as well as other federal agencies and some of the services. Figuring out exactly how you want to use it, how you want to use that bandwidth, that's the first step in working out a deployment. I think the second thing is fully vetting out the security of the system. So there's a tremendous security capability in 5G. It was one of the focuses of what went into the development of that technology. But looking at that security posture in the context of the full use case and the full system is something that I think is still work that's ongoing. Next, there's packaging of that 5G capability to meet some of those unique private wireless use cases. So some of these are ready today, and it's stuff that we've done and deployed with enterprises, such as warehousing or logistics use cases. The cases for federal agencies are very, very similar to what we would drive into enterprise there. But as we start to look at things like a tactical use case or a shipborne use case, that's where we really sit in with architects from folks in Bryan's team and say, hey, what do we need to do to adapt the packaging of this capability, this 5G technology to fit those use cases? So I would say those are the three big things from my mind. That's the work in front of us to begin to see these big 5G deployments, private wireless.
And so how do you go about securing 5G networks for civilian and defense agencies?
When we talk about 5G, I think one of the things that gets missed a lot is never before we had a technology that goes across many different ways of doing business. When we look at 5G and securing it, right, a 5G smartphone, for instance, right, it's going to use the same relatively a mobile device management to secure that particular device. But what 5G also offers are things like fixed wireless access, right, or the ability we're using 5G for broadband, right? So where an agency would use terrestrial like a VPN, other mechanisms to connect to their networks like an APN or mobile private network, they can do that with 5G. And then what Mike said, I think where you get into the new frontier is using 5G on the private side or also on the tactical side is you're actually putting in probably more security just from a physical standpoint where you're actually having the core actually on-prem on the government agency, right? So not just from a physical security standpoint, but also having the ability to actually see who's on your network and also control that. So when you look at 5G, and you can put other things on there like zero trust architecture, and you can incorporate that multiple factor authentication, right? So that's all standard or table stakes, if you will, in terms of security. But I think one of the things where 5G is a little bit different is you can have one medium of transmission that can serve multiple needs, right? And using existing security models, in some cases adding additional security models, like things like GPS, right? Where we're starting to see now with 5G and ultra low latency, and you see this today, right? You'll see get different challenges, right? Because I'm pulling the GPS off your particular device. So you're in a certain area, I may not want to give you that information based off of different threat vectors, if you will. So very excited about the about 5G, but it starts at some of the simplest things of actually just having trusted suppliers for actually critical network infrastructure.
A lot of the new capabilities in terms of networking get touted on 5G, but really security was a major focus for 3GPP in the evolution from 4G to 5G. And I think this is one of the reasons why the U.S. government has made a bet on 5G, if you will, in some of their strategy and position papers. But if we look at some of these enhancements in 5G, the transport layer is encrypted end to end throughout in a 5G network. So all the way from the UE through the core of the network. There's encryption. All of the elements within the 5G network have control plane authentication and a secure control plane connection. So every single control element is authenticated. Another really big enhancement in 5G relative to the previous generations was the previous generations, the network would authenticate the UE and say, hey, is this a UE that's supposed to attach to the network? If so, let it on. In 5G, it's a two-way handshake. So the UE's also authenticating the network, and that helps prevent man-in-the-middle attacks where a network could be spoofed. Finally, you have slicing. That's a pretty well-known capability that went into 5G. And if there's data plane security issues where people want to just make sure there's provenance in all of the elements that a particular packet could touch, we can build slices across a network that make sure that traffic only passes through elements that are known trusted. On top of that, so natively, I think 5G is just it's night and day security posture compared to previous generations. And we see some other agencies, and I think Bryan touched on this, but there is a lot of capability that's also coming out that allows people to augment the security posture of the 5G network with encryption over the top. And one of these are, well known as commercial solutions for classified, CSFC, are coming out, and that's a capability we can add to the connected devices on a 5G network, and that enables a secure connection on top of an already secure IP connectivity model that's provided by the 5G network. So, I think a lot of the tools are in place, and as I indicated previously on security, from my perspective, now I'm not the one giving the approval to operate on these networks, but from my perspective, the security building blocks are all there, and what's really required is looking at how these security building blocks are assembled in the context of a particular use case.
And we know security is one aspect, but how does 5G then tie into the broader federal network infrastructure for that agencies already have existing? Bryan, we'll start with you.
Great question, Amanda. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'll just build on that and what the great comments that Mike just made here. So we see it as we come out of COVID, right, and out of the pandemic, right? There's still a huge need for remote connectivity, right? And that's one aspect, I think, that 5G. We still have in this great country, we still have a last mile problem in terms of providing high speed broadband access, and we look at 5G actually doing that. So when we look at federal agencies actually upgrading, we actually see as we decommission things like TDM connections or low bandwidth connections on terrestrial or landline networks, we're seeing that supplemented with actually 5G or 4G technology in a primary or backup role, right? So we see that aspect. We also see a huge push. I think what you're going to see at the end of this year going into 23, and as we get over the pandemic, but also the supply chain crunch, is you're going to see more 5G enabled devices, right? So beyond your smartphones, your tablets, we're seeing a lot of things from gateway routers, right? So the wonderful thing, if between Mike and myself, between Verizon and Nokia, we build these great networks, but there is no way to connect to these networks, it doesn't do anybody any good, right? So you're going to see the proliferation of 5G enabled devices as the chipsets come down. That's why you always saw them in your high-end, smartphone devices. Why? Because they're very expensive. But as you get further down in terms of getting greater economies of scale, you'll start seeing that actually, start to go through the ecosystem out there where it gives more choice, better competition, and more device choice out to individuals, right? So your main manufacturers that make routers and gateway switches all now have 5G SKUs. We're starting to see more OEMs, your laptop manufacturers now having 5G embedded chipsets in them. The ball is rolling. It's only going to get bigger in terms of a snowball effect, right? So, and then from an agency consumption standpoint, we're seeing, agencies upgrade their 3G devices in some cases, now the 4G, and more importantly, the 5G. So that is happening. And then, as I mentioned before, we're upgrading our networks, as well as DoD, as well as our civilian agencies are now adopting and looking at private networks. It's just on all fronts, we're seeing a lot of huge 5G adoption, but more importantly, it goes into the mission or the agency's requirements, if you will, in terms of serving the citizens, how do they become more agile? How do we have a better experience for the citizens, right? And we see this not just in DoD, that right now a lot of their R&D, but we see this more on the civilian side, which I think you're going to see more going to 23 and 24. You're going to see more proliferation, I would say, on the civilian side compared to the DoD is going to continue what they do, but I think you're going to see more uptick on 5G infrastructure within the civilian federal agencies.
I guess I'll answer this question in two ways. First, I'd like to say that let's just simplify things and recognize that 5G is an access technology for an IP connection, and that's the base function. And IP connectivity into federal network infrastructure is a solved problem, and it's a problem that Verizon solved, and dating back to private IP. We'll use the same exact tools, the same exact security mechanics that companies like Verizon have used to solve that problem, and the federal agencies have used to solve that problem in the past. So there should be no mystery. 5G is an access technology, and it provides an IP connection back into these networks. And you have to think about that. There's always considerations with that IP connection, but it's something folks have been doing for a long time. I think one thing that's very interesting as we think about connecting into the broader federal network infrastructure, this is the second, kind of way I'd like to answer this question. There's some, very high profile, very strategic programs out there, notably Joint All Domain Command and Control, or JADC2. And one of the core problems that JADC2 is looking to address is how to democratize information out to the various constituents inside the Department of Defense. It's a recognition that they've got a lot of data out there. There's a lot of capability, and it can be siloed, or it's not in the hands all the time of the people that need the data or information in a timely way. How do they solve that? One way to solve that is democratize that data on IP and a common access technology, the 5G handset. It's ubiquitous. It's a well-known commercial technology. It's relatively cheap compared to some of the other access technologies. And it's just a matter of securing and that capability, and then meeting those various systems at IP. There's a lot more to it, but I think it's a building block technology that can help that program.
Thank you both for helping us understand that integration. So outside of the US, how can federal and defense agencies leverage 5G connectivity when they're not on US soil?
Yeah, great question, Amanda. So actually, with our partnership with Nokia, we have the actually ability to build out private 5G networks outside the United States, right? So it's a great way of actually, we've gotten some requests and some inquiries right now of actually doing that, right? So 5G is just not a CONUS inside the continental United States. There is an OCONUS play, and obviously the military as well as other civilian agencies are looking to do so. Also, I would say just on the near and dear, right? Verizon has a lot of great roaming agreements with a lot of international carriers. So we actually do this today on 4G technology. And as the rest of the world, actually, where the U.S. is probably leading in a lot of cases in terms of 5G, in terms of deployment, in terms of mass scale, the U.S. is leading in a lot of cases in terms of 5G. But rest assured, we can actually do roaming agreements with these international carriers. But as Mike and I have worked on a couple opportunities already, we are seeing the need to actually have deployable 5G tactical networks in theater of combat, as well as supporting particular agencies that actually have large field offices overseas as well. So a couple of different ways of actually doing it, but yeah, obviously 5G is just not a US based technology. It is a global technology, and in some cases, obviously, as I mentioned before, from a nation state standpoint, that's probably one of the biggest concerns that we see with the U.S. government, right? Is the United States falling behind when it comes to next generation technologies like 5G? Very excited about the opportunity as Verizon as well as Nokia are global companies, the ability to actually provide that connectivity, not just domestically, but more importantly, internationally. And as Mike will mention, galactically as well.
I think Bryan said it very, very well. This 5G technology is a capability we can deploy anywhere. We can deploy it in OCONUS installations. We can deploy it in a forward operating base or in a tactical environment. And, we've developed solutions with Verizon for this. So it's really all about how do I get the IP connectivity of that forward deployed network back to the core network and applications and information I'm interested in, and that's a problem that Verizon solves. So it's a great partnership.
And I know Brian mentioned galactically, Mike, so talk to us about the possibilities of 5G in space.
This is one of my favorite subjects. So we've got a couple of public announcements that I'll reference here, and let's talk about 5G in space in two contexts. The first context is, how about I deploy a 5G network in space or non-terrestrial? We've done a couple of variants of this publicly. In this case, I'll mention low Earth orbit or LEO satellites, and we've partnered with a company called AST Space Mobile, who selected Nokia AirScale RAN, and we're deploying that on their Blue Walker satellites. And this gives the capability to put 5G coverage into places that are not easy to get with, or are not economic to get to commercially through, terrestrial-based towers. So AST Mobile's built this capability, and their intent, and they're partnering with service providers to fully integrate their non-terrestrial LEO space-based 5G capability to augment the terrestrial networks. It's in a commercial context, but the intent is, hey, if you need coverage somewhere that you don't have any towers, come talk to us, and we've got a 5G signal there, and we'll integrate it into your network. Now, that has a lot of applicability for a defense use case, maybe not specifically with AST Mobile, maybe with them, but the idea is that for sure we can deploy 5G RAN in a non-terrestrial position and provide 5G coverage in hard to get places. I guess the second use case is, I want people in space to talk on a 5G network, and that's another program that we've launched publicly. Nokia Bell Labs was selected to be part of the NASA Artemis program, and the idea here was to put a lunar cellular service on the moon. And there's a big idea that says, let's invest on infrastructure such that someday we could possibly have a permanent lunar installation. And if you're going to do that, then you have to think about things like, hey, how do I have communications? How do I get power? How do I, get oxygen? Whatever it is, there's a lot of core capabilities that need to be developed to enable that. And this is one of those. And so that's a public program, and that involved us, building a very compact, very low power, ultra ruggedized LTE core and RAN network that could survive in those lunar conditions. I think there's a lot of possibilities there across at least two use cases.
That's very exciting. Brian, is there anything you'd like to add about how this could impact or change things for 5G network?
To Mike's point, we're excited about what is possible, right, to actually do this in space, right, which is very exciting. And we actually have some announcements that we'll be making here in the near future on some technologies we're also incorporating with low orbital satellites, which is very exciting for here at Verizon, right? So to Mike's earlier comment, right, I mean, this is IP transmission. So when you look at this IP transmission, it's just, can we do this tactically? Can we do this off a macro cellular network? And more importantly, what are the potential use cases that we see with 5G, right? So having one technology, one standard that can go beyond just a smartphone and bridge some of the gaps out there and get into other technologies where we've seen, for instance, traditional land mobile radios play into space, right? Now we're actually using the 5G technology in there and running different operations. So it's an exciting time. I think in some cases it might be a confusing time, right, for a lot of agencies out there, but rest assured, the technology we're looking to deploy is upgradable, and it's going to be out here for the foreseeable future, right? So as Mike mentioned earlier comment, was we launched 4G LTE in 2010, right? So we're all, going on our 13th year of deploying that, and where we were in 2010 and where we are today at the end of 2022 are vastly different, right? And as we launched 5G in 2019, what's that going to look like in 2029? It is going to be radically different where we are today, which is exciting, right? But there are things that the agencies can do now to, to get into 5G. They should be doing some basic things like upgrading their devices, looking at 5G and broadband. And I think the next frontier that's very exciting is looking at private 5G as well as 5G on tactical networks. That's where we see some of the accelerants taking it and really showing what you can do in a mobile environment, that you're not constrained by four walls. That is very exciting out there when we see 5G at the full potential, and bringing things like what Mike mentioned, right? As we migrate, in which we publicly announced going to a 5G standalone core, going to full release 16, and then as we get into 23, as Mike mentioned, it slices and dices. So we will talk about slicing as we get into 2023 and some of the new capabilities that we'll have on 5G in the very near future going into next year.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian. And Mike, anything you'd like to add? I know we just talked about space, so how much more future could we get than that? But anything you'd like to add about the future of 5G and what that may look like for defense and federal agencies going forward?
I think it's a very exciting mission, and it's a very exciting opportunity to get to work on this particular technology with the federal agencies in defense. It holds a lot of promise. Certainly, sort of that big picture vision of having all the data you need in a timely manner to help make decisions, wherever you are. That's a big thing, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. But we can see the beginnings of that end state. For me, I really enjoy solving that problem. I enjoy being part of it and working with a lot of smart people to kind of work through some of the challenges.
And Brian, any closing statements?
No, I think it's a great opportunity. We talk about this. I get excited about 5G. This is what I live and do every day. Very fortunate to do so, and using this next generation technology to enable connectivity to rural areas, but more importantly, increasing the capabilities of the government to serve its people. What we're able to do, I think one of the things that is a misnomer for the federal government, we have every vertical. Right? We have every vertical in the federal government, anything from healthcare to public safety to law to finance to logistics. If you look at postal service and rail and Amtrak, it is really astounding what we're able to do and actually work with all those different verticals with the guys of actually all being federal agencies and using this technology that can do and serve many multiple needs, and having one medium transmission is mind-boggling to some extent.